Brigandine, The Legend of Forsena is a strategy RPG for the PS1. There is a sequel to this game, which changes the subtitle. I initially thought it was a remaster or a remake, but we'll get to that one at some other point. This is a game I remember owning when I was a kid. Didn't spend a whole lot of time with it, and I don't remember liking it too much when I first got it. Probably because I just didn't understand it and moved on to something else. I think I got it at the same time as Tactics Ogre and Cardia, so I most likely moved on to one of those games. It was really just a stroke of luck that I bought all three of them at the same time. It was in, I think, 99 or 2000 when PS1 games were starting to drop in price, and they all happened to be there. I really liked Atlas, so I got all three of them. And this one kind of fell through the cracks for me. Playing it now, I have a very different impression of it. I really like it a lot. It reminds me of some of the turn-based Koei strategy games, specifically Gemfire, but it's a little bit more than that, and I don't have a really good comparison for what this game is, aside from the fact that it's a turn-based strategy RPG. I do have a few things I'm going to say about the story later on, but that's for when I get into a few of the reviews for this game at the time. This game takes place on the continent of Forsena. There are 6 countries that make up this continent. They have all been at war or politically aligned or something like that in the past. The game starts with Elmika, the central kingdom, and they've got this really great general who had been leading them to victories against the northern kingdom, and then through some political dealings and everything, and most likely some manipulation, this guy Zemeckis decides he's going to overthrow the kingdom and declare it an empire, and then eventually try to take over the whole continent. This sends the prince of Elmika fleeing to another country. He creates the kingdom of New Elmika. And then you just have each of these kingdoms with their own storyline as they try to take over the continent. It's pretty cool, actually, because each faction has its own kind of a loose story to follow, like their own motivations for why they're doing what they're doing. It's pretty fun. You also get a few kind of like side stories that are going on at the same time, because you've got each of these generals, they've got their own relationships and that sort of thing. It's pretty great. I mean, it's not like an amazing or an in-depth story. You don't really need to know everything that's happening. And in some cases, you probably don't even need a whole lot of the story that they give you, but it's kind of cool that it's there. 5 of the 6 factions are playable right away. You can get the Empire, or Zemeckis' faction, once you enter in a cheat code, but right out of the box, you only have 5 playable. And yeah, they're kind of interesting. One thing to note in this is all of the generals in this game are what's referred to as Rune Knights. Don't worry, you don't really need to know that. It doesn't mean all of them are knights. Some of them are magic users and that sort of thing. It's just the name that they give generals. I don't know why games try to be fancy like that, but whatever. It kind of adds to some of the lore of the world, but if you don't know that, it's not necessary. Each of these generals, they can summon monsters and control them in battle. That makes up the armies. It's pretty cool. I really, really like this. And it's just a really great idea. The gameplay is kind of hit and miss. Overall, it's very good, but we'll get into that in just a second. Overall, I really like the gameplay. It can be a little slow for some people, and it does remind me of playing, one of the Koei strategy games. The combat is, it's okay. It might take you a little while to just get used to some of the kind of weirdness that goes on in it. Some of the things that feel like they should be really important aren't, but overall, it's really good. So each of your turns is divided into two parts. You have one where you're organizing your armies and moving them around. This is when you can recruit monsters and change the makeup of your units. Each one of the generals has like a specific number of points that can be allotted to the different characters. So certain monsters are much bigger, they need more kind of command points, I guess, than others. And that kind of monkeys with the makeup of what you can do with your units. It's kind of fun. I like that. It adds a little bit of strategy to how you want to customize your different armies. That's a cool part about the game. I do like that quite a bit. It can be fun to just figure out what you want to do with each unit and try to balance it out so that it's not too weak or something along those lines. If you look hard enough online, you can probably find some guide on how to best set up your units. I don't like doing that. I like just messing around and figuring out what works for me. That's part of the customization process of this. I just really enjoy doing that sort of thing instead of looking up, okay, well, I need to have this unit in order to be the best at whatever. That's never been interesting to me. I always like messing around with this stuff. Each one of your monsters can be upgraded at least once. Some of them can get upgraded more, which is pretty awesome. I like that. It gives you a reason to try to keep your monsters alive and try to not, just throw them into a beat grinder. Sometimes you have to do that, but it would behoove you to not, just because you can upgrade them, get better monsters. It's a really cool experience system where everything has its own different leveling up system. So that's pretty fun. Once you win a battle, everybody gets bonus experience, so you don't necessarily need to throw a level 1 monster at something and just hope for the best. In the second phase, that's when your attack actually takes place. So you can move your units into the best position to try to defend things, because everything happens in like a town grid on this. And then you can move your units to attack the enemy. It takes a little time to figure out where you want to attack, because you're going to have a lot of options. Some countries are better defended than others, so yeah, there's a lot of strategy that goes into this. And you might have to give up a town in order to get like a bigger victory overall. It's really a fun strategy game once you get into everything that's going on. Like many of these games, there are a few factors that you might want to take into account when you're getting into a fight. That is the level of your characters. There's also this elemental system that sort of acts like a weapons triangle. If I had to point to something about the gameplay that just feels half-baked, it would be that system, because it just doesn't really play that big of a factor, or as big of a factor as you might think. There are a few different colors that your monsters can be. They can be red, blue, green, black, white, or colorless. In this system, if you have a red monster fighting a blue monster, they get a little bit of an advantage. It can also be a double red versus a single blue, that sort of thing. If you have a green character, they don't really have a opposite alignment. They kind of just fall into a gray area where it doesn't really give your opponent an advantage or give you an advantage. A black character is, strong against a white character. And then there's the neutral colors, which don't have an opposing element, and it feels like there should have been something that was replacing the no color, because green doesn't have an opposite. It just feels like this one part of the game should have been a bigger factor, and there should have been something else there. It just feels a little half-baked. The rest of the combat is very good. It doesn't really take into account direction of combat. Terrain does play a factor, level plays a factor, and in some cases, elemental alignment plays a factor. Your generals also have elemental alignment. They're also come in different classes, so if you have a mage, you don't want them on the front line, that sort of thing. It's a really cool system, and it's a lot of fun to dig into. Overall, it's a very competent strategy game. It's a lot of fun to go through and play this. It's really fun to figure out how you want to set up your army. It's a lot of fun to just go through and play the different factions and find one that you like more than the others. That was probably the biggest thing with this. I had a lot of fun just messing around with it and trying to find something that I enjoyed. I really love the gameplay in this. There are really two things to talk about with the graphics here. I think the sprites and the overworld, that all looked good for 1999 when the game was released in North America. There are two versions of the game, so if you imported the Grand Edition, which was only released in Japan, it probably looked a whole hell of a lot better, because all of the 3D animation and everything was replaced with 2D. The opening cutscene is an anime cutscene, so that all probably looked a lot better than the cutscenes we get in this. I think oh god, how would I have thought about this back then? I might have liked it back in 1999, just the cutscenes and the opening cutscene and the combat and stuff. I might have liked that, because the models aren't terrible. They look okay for late 90s, early 2000s. I think they get the job done, but looking at them now and seeing what other games would be able to do in 1999, I just don't like them as much. They just look a little bit too blocky for me. They aren't bad by any stretch of the means. I just think they're a little underwhelming. There is a little problem, or at least a problem that I had when I was in these battles and just trying to tell which monsters were mine and which ones were the enemy. They're color-coded, but sometimes those colors are really close together, and if you're sitting far away from the TV, you might not be able to tell them apart. Sometimes it's very obvious, like if you are playing as the red group and you're going up against yellow, that's pretty easy to tell the difference, but they got two different shades of blue here, and that's not really that helpful. And even dark blue, with how small the indicator is, that can kind of look like purple. If you're colorblind, you're probably just fucked. I don't know what to tell you. It's really not that great of a system, but it's there. So one faction's red, one faction's light blue, one is dark blue, one is yellow, one is green, and one is purple. Thankfully, you don't fight more than one faction at a time, at least not on the battle screen. So there's that at least, but it can be a little bit of a problem. I really wish that we had gotten the Grand Edition, because reading about what that game looks like with the anime cutscene at the very beginning with the 2D sprites instead of the 3D models, that sounds like it probably just would have aged a lot better than some of the graphics in this, because everything outside of the combat screens looks really good still. But when you look at those combat screens, they're just not as good as they probably could have been. It's the best the developers could have done at the time, but when you compare it to other strategy games, it's just not as good. So I looked at 3 reviews for Brigandine. The highest was an 8 out of 10, the lowest that I looked at was a 3 out of 10. The reviews came from GameSpot, PSX Nation, and IGN. Let's get the IGN review out of the way first. It's pathetic. They gave the game a 3 out of 10, and I don't think the reviewer actually played the game. They summarized a story for a game that doesn't exist, and then they critiqued that story that they made up. It really is that bad. Then the reviewer compared the game to Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy Tactics, which are probably the only 2 games that the author ever played. The IGN is one of those reviews that you just have to go and read to believe. It seems the reviewer didn't know what he was getting into, immediately hated it, and yeah, I mean, he wrote on the tag, his tagline for it was, Atlas releases a Chinese water torture simulator. He really felt, or at least it feels like he thought this was going to be Final Fantasy Tactics, and when it wasn't that, he just immediately wrote the game off. I don't even know why he reviewed it. But yeah, it's a really, really terrible review. He had to have gotten into one battle, hated it, and then turned the thing off. I don't even know how he butchered the story because it tells you at the very beginning. I'm guessing he just tuned out and immediately said, yeah, this game is terrible. The GameSpot review, they gave it a 6 out of 10. And I need to say at the time, in 1999 and 2000, this was considered above average. A 5 was an average game, anything above that, above average. The reviewer didn't really have any major issues with the game, and I think they were the only reviewer who had played more than like one tactical or strategy RPG. Because, he brought up that Brigandine was released in a very, crowded field. It had to compete with Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Ogre, Cardia, Vandal Hearts. You also had a version of Ogre Battle that was out there, so it was competing with all of those, and it probably just got lost in the shuffle. Also, the gameplay being different from all of those didn't really help it that much. It's very close to how Gemfire was played, and I think the reviewer did his best to kind of say, it's not bad, but it's not as good as these other tactical and strategy RPGs on the market. So, PSX Nation, they gave the game an 8 out of 10. The review was really painful to read. I'm not sure where the author got some of the information for the review. They compare it again to Final Fantasy Tactics, which I just don't think is a fair comparison because they're very different games. The reviewer liked it, but I have some just overall issues with it. Both the PSX Nation and the IGN review, I don't really know what their deal was. They seem to have been written in a language that wasn't English and then translated over, or at least that's my idea of what it was, because there's just some weird errors, especially in the PSX Nation one. I'm not a good writer, and I was looking at what they wrote and just thinking, wow, I've no idea what they're telling me. I don't know why they used those words. Stuff is just strange. It really seemed like the reviewers found the game's story too complicated, which is just freaking odd. It's fairly straightforward. Two of the reviewers looked at it and just flat out made shit up and then critiqued what they made up. I don't get it. It's just very strange. I understand the comparisons with Final Fantasy Tactics because that was probably the most well-known strategy or tactical RPG released at the time, but I just don't think it's fair because the games are just very different. And you kind of have to reach pretty far back in order to have something to compare Brigandine to. There was a game called, I think, Masters of Monsters, and that is a lot closer to it because it uses the same kind of hex grid system. There's just not a great comparison for this game on the market at the time. And comparing it to Final Fantasy Tactics, it's really just not fair. This is a game that I like more now than when I was in high school and I first played it. Back then, I just didn't have enough patience for a game like this. And yeah, I didn't spend as much time trying to figure it out as I did this time. I also didn't have the internet either, so that didn't help. So having the internet helped out an awful lot because it kind of filled in some of the gaps with just the stuff that I didn't really know. Back then, I was more interested in playing stuff like Cardia or Tactics Ogre, or even Final Fantasy Tactics, or going back and playing Ogre Battle. There were just a lot of these games at the time, and yeah, I think Brigandine just wasn't as interesting, or it wasn't as fast paced. You didn't get into it as quickly as those other games. And that's part of the problem with it. It's slower. The graphics, especially on the combat scene, those are not as good as some of the others. Overall, it's still a pretty fun game. If you get into it, you like this sort of thing, you'll probably have fun with it. If you don't, there are plenty of other tactical and strategy RPGs out there. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.